I learned the truth about my husband the moment his father died in my arms. While I was trying to keep the old man breathing, Mason wasn't on his way home. He had paid someone to take care of him, and when that man showed up at the door with restraints and sedatives, I realized something brutal. My husband hadn't just abandoned us. He wanted his own father gone. My name is Sydney Brooks, and this is the Thanksgiving I came home and discovered the man I loved was willing to let someone die for money. By the time I left the highway and began climbing the narrow mountain road, the daylight had thinned to a pale ribbon stretched across the sky. Fresh snow clung to the pines, and the tires hummed beneath me in a rhythm I hadn't heard in months. Each mile toward the little town tucked behind the Sangre de Cristo range loosened something tight inside my chest. I kept imagining the warmth waiting at the end of the drive, the familiar crunch of gravel, the soft glow from the windows of the cabin where Mason grew up. For the first time in a long while, I let myself believe we might find our way back to each other. But when I pulled up beside the porch, that hope died before I could even kill the engine. The house was dark, every window a mirror of the fading light. No footsteps padding across the floorboards, no dog barking from inside, not even the faint crackle of the wood stove that usually burned straight through the holidays. Only wind whipping across the railings, carrying a cold sharp enough to crawl under my coat. I knocked once, then again. Nothing. The lock turned easily, untouched, and the moment I stepped inside, the chill deepened. The air felt abandoned, heavy with a stillness that didn't belong in a lived-in home. A thin coat of dust muted the shine on the kitchen table. Flyers had drifted across the entryway from an overstuffed mail slot. On the counter sat a mug stained with dried coffee, something Mason never drank without cream. There was no sign he'd been here in days. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence pressing in from every direction, and a slow tightening spread through my chest. Whatever waited beyond the hallway wasn't simple forgetfulness or poor timing. It felt deliberate. Wrong. And as the cold settled around my ankles, I understood something I couldn't yet explain. This homecoming was about to unravel a truth I wasn't prepared to face. I called Mason's name as I moved farther down the hallway, my voice echoing strangely against the cold boards beneath my feet. A draft curled around my ankles like a warning, growing sharper the closer I got to the living room. Then I heard it, an uneven, rattling sound, so faint I thought for a moment the wind had slipped through the walls. But when I switched on the small lamp by the sofa, the truth washed over me like ice. Thomas Hale lay collapsed against the cushions, his body shrunken beneath clothes that hung too loosely on him. His skin was a dull gray, lips cracked, breath shallow and stuttering as if each inhale cost him. Containers of spoiled food surrounded him, stacked in a clutter that told a story of days, not hours. Pills were scattered across the rug, some snapped in half as though stepped on by someone who didn't care enough to pick them up. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then landing on me with a flicker of relief. That small spark made the scene even worse. He shouldn't have been waiting for anyone. Someone should have been here already. A sick realization rose in my throat. I wasn't late. He had been abandoned. Instinct kicked in. I checked his pulse, lifted him upright to ease his breathing, wrapped a blanket around his trembling frame. He couldn't have eaten, taken medication, or even stood without help. And still, no one had been caring for him. As I eased him back down, his hand clutched my wrist with surprising strength. His fingers were freezing. His voice broke into jagged whispers. "Find the box. Mason knows." The words dissolved into shallow breaths, but the meaning hit hard. What box? And why would Mason know about it? That question pierced the doubt I'd been trying to quiet since walking through the door. Something about Mason's disappearance was not accidental, and this house held more than neglect. It held intent. I tore through the house with growing urgency. Every corner confirmed the same truth. Mason hadn't been home in days. The call log was empty, the bed untouched, half his clothes gone. On the kitchen counter sat a crooked note, The handwriting jagged and slanted in a way that didn't belong to him. Gone to Nevada, back soon. It felt less like a message and more like an excuse someone hoped I wouldn't question. But I did. When I turned on his tablet, a map lit up with 3 nights logged in Las Vegas, a casino hotel, bar charges, club fees, a spa bill, and then a hotel room booked for 2. My stomach tightened as I scrolled. I had come home looking for my husband. Instead, I was tracing a pattern of choices he'd hidden, back in the living room. I picked up Thomas's pain medication. The liquid inside looked watered down. Too pale, too thin. I opened the trash bin and found a bottle cap coated with the sharp scent of antiseptic. Someone had diluted his medicine, not accidentally, not from carelessness, deliberately. As I looked at Thomas's labored breaths beneath the weak glow of the lamp, an icy dread crept through me. For the first time, I wasn't just worried about where Mason had gone. I was terrified of what he had become. I spent the rest of the morning stabilizing Thomas, warming his body with the electric blanket until the violent tremors eased. Only when his breathing evened out did I finally let myself look at the house through different eyes. Clinical, alert, the way years of emergencies had trained me. I opened the medicine cabinet again, this time with gloves and a flashlight. The seal on his pain medication had been broken twice, a clear sign someone tampered with it. The bottle beside it carried Mason's name. And when I reached for Mason's jacket hanging by the window, a stray pill slipped from the pocket and hit the floor. In the trash. A tissue stained with a watery residue made my stomach drop. A quick test strip confirmed it wasn't any prescribed medication, but a diluted solution. Someone had intentionally weakened what little comfort Thomas had left. I clenched my hands hard enough to feel the bones press against each other. This wasn't neglect. Someone wanted his pain to worsen. I turned to the laptop Mason had left behind and pulled up his banking history. The pattern was unmistakable. Daily cash withdrawals between $400 and $600 for nearly 3 weeks. No one traveling for work would drain money like that. His email inbox looked unremarkable until a message from someone named Renee L. appeared. One line punched the air from my lungs. I haven't forgotten that night. Vegas again next week? Heat prickled beneath my skin, equal parts shame and fury. When I opened the fridge to fetch water for Thomas, a paper slipped to the floor. A Flamingo Hotel and Casino receipt stared up at me. Dinner for 2, a shared room. I remembered the date instantly, the night he'd told me he was stuck in a meeting. I returned to the living room, scanning the floor. Faint tracks in the wood led toward the storage cellar. Inside, most of Mason's toolboxes were gone. He hadn't left in a hurry. He'd packed. He'd planned. He'd started building a life without me, and without the man lying helpless in the living room. And in that cold silence, one truth settled like a stone in my chest. There was nothing about Mason I could trust anymore. By late afternoon, Thomas stirred again. His breaths came jagged, his eyes clouded. But when I sat him upright and brought water to his lips, he looked at me with a depth that broke something inside me. He asked what I had found, and I told him the truth about the medication and Mason's likely involvement. His eyelids lowered, not in shock, but in grief. Through struggling breaths, he forced out fragments. The boy owes money. Carpenter wants the land. He's afraid I'll sign. The name Carpenter chilled me. I'd carried enough patience from that developer's properties to know he didn't play fair. If Mason owed him, the land was the only payment worth anything. I asked why Mason hadn't simply sought help. Thomas gave a strained, bitter smile. Then he admitted Mason had pushed him to sign the deed. And when he refused, the medication suddenly became an expense Mason didn't want to cover. This was no longer family tension. This was a calculated attempt to take everything from him. I asked about the box he mentioned earlier. He pointed weakly toward a scratched section of the floor. Beneath the plank was a wooden container holding a draft will naming me as heir, along with the land deed and a letter overflowing with a tenderness Mason had never shown him. He had chosen me long before this. As I slipped the documents into my bag, Mason's name flashed across my phone with a message. Don't touch anything. Someone's coming to help. A knock echoed outside. Heavy footsteps approached, a pickup pulled into the drive, and a man in scrubs stepped onto the porch, claiming he was sent by Mason to care for Thomas. But the look in his eyes told me exactly what he was here to do. The man at the door wore scrubs, but nothing about him felt medical. His eyes swept past me toward the living room, as if he were searching for an opening rather than a patient. I kept the door barely cracked, blocking his view of Thomas, who was still struggling for breath behind me. He spoke in a flat tone, like someone repeating lines he'd practiced. "I'm here for Mr. Hale." Mason arranged it. I gave him a thin, humorless smile. The kind you give when you know you're being lied to. If that's true, show me your license. He hesitated just long enough to betray himself. When I glanced down, something protruding from his kit caught my attention. Restraints. The heavy-duty kind used for combative patients in ER settings, never for fragile seniors. Alongside them was a vial labeled midazolam 10 milliliters. No one brings a sedative like that to a private home unless they intend to shut someone down. Not help them. This man hadn't come to treat Thomas. He'd come to finish what someone else had started. My hand slid toward the phone in my pocket. "Produce your credentials, or I'm calling the sheriff." His face shifted, tension flashing into cold calculation, before he abruptly turned and retreated down the porch steps. As he walked off, a slip of paper fell from his jacket. I picked it up. A deposit receipt for caregiving services, signed by Mason Hale. Everything inside me went still. Mason hadn't sent someone to help his father. He'd sent someone to ensure he didn't survive. Back inside, my pulse hammered beneath my ribs. Thomas's eyes, clouded and fading, met mine as I checked his vitals. His pressure had dropped dangerously low. I called a doctor in Denver to confirm emergency steps, all while steadying his posture to ease the strain on his lungs. When I bent down to retrieve his fallen blanket, a folder half hidden under the sofa caught my eye. I tugged it free. Inside was a deed file, and a note in Mason's handwriting promising Carpenter $200,000 once the land transferred. The answer slammed into me. Mason wasn't overwhelmed or careless. He was clearing a path to sell everything. I checked Mason's location again on the tablet. The dot pulsed only 35 minutes away. He was coming back, and he wasn't coming alone. A new message appeared on my screen. "Don't do anything stupid. I'm bringing help." Headlights began climbing the snowy road outside. The chill that ran through me wasn't fear, it was certainty. Mason was returning to finish the job. Before those headlights reached the driveway, I pried open the old box beneath the floorboard, the one Thomas had pointed toward the day before. The lock resisted before snapping open. At the bottom lay a complete draft of a will naming me as heir. Dated 4 months earlier, explained with a line that tightened my throat. The only one who still protects what matters. A red-tied envelope held a police report. Mason had once been arrested for illegal gambling in Albuquerque and freed only because Thomas paid his fines. He had hidden even that from me. A truck rolled to a stop outside. I shoved the box back under the sofa and peered out the window. Mason stepped out, coat dusted with silver powder from casino tables. Behind him came the fake caregiver and a man in a leather jacket, someone clearly tied to the land deal. None of them carried grief. They carried expectation. I hurried to Thomas. His chest barely rose. "You want me to protect your land, don't you?" His eyes opened just enough to answer. His hand lifted weakly to his pocket. I reached inside and pulled out a small metal key. The key to his bank's safe deposit box, the one holding the real will. He whispered broken words, directing me to retrieve it. Then, his pulse faded beneath my fingers. Slipping away just as the front door opened and Mason called into the house. I looked down at the key resting in my palm. Everything Thomas fought to preserve now depended on what I did next. I tucked it into my coat and turned toward the hallway, ready to face Mason, only for Thomas's hand to tighten around mine one final time. His last breath left him like a quiet charge passed into me. By the time Mason entered, Thomas was gone. Mason stepped inside, breath whitening in the cold air, the smell of smoke and someone else's perfume drifting from his jacket. Behind him, the fake nurse hovered like he was waiting for an order, and the landbroker scanned the room as though inspecting a property, not a home that had just lost its last heartbeat. I stood between them and the sofa. He's gone. Mason. He froze, not in sorrow, but in startled calculation. His eyes jerked toward the man he'd hired. I held up the receipt the nurse had dropped, the one bearing Mason's name and the payment for so-called care. His face drained. The medication was tampered with. I said, "Your GPS shows Vegas. You left him suffering so you could pay debts and run around with someone else." He raised his voice, insisting I didn't understand. But I cut him off. "You were selling this land to Carpenter. You needed him gone before he could sign anything." The broker stepped back, muttering that Carpenter said everything would move faster once Thomas was dead. Mason's jaw tightened, panic cracking through. I told him the sheriff and Thomas's attorney were on their way. He lunged for my coat, the pocket with the key, but I stepped back. "You're not taking anything from me again." And for the first time, Mason looked afraid. Mason was still catching his breath when the crunch of tires sounded outside. Two deputies stepped through the doorway, their eyes shifting from Thomas's still body to Mason's shaking hands, dusted with the same silver powder lingering on his jacket. Rachel Whitford, Thomas's attorney, entered behind them. She met my gaze with a firm nod, the kind that told me I hadn't misread a single thing. "We have reason to believe Thomas Hale was intentionally neglected," she said to Mason. "All related documentation will need to be reviewed." Mason let out a strained laugh, trying to mold himself back into a grieving son. "I loved my father. I would never—" "What about the altered medication?" I cut in. "Or your GPS trail to Vegas? The man you paid to come here? The pressure you put on Thomas to sign away his land?" The broker lowered his eyes to the floorboards, voice barely audible. "I was only hired to deliver paperwork. I didn't know anything else." Rachel unclasped her briefcase and set a stack of documents on the table. "This," she said, "is the legally executed will from 4 months ago. Thomas left all property and assets to Sidney Brooks." The weight of the papers hitting the wood might as well have been the sound of Mason's world collapsing. His face drained to ash. "No, that can't be." One deputy stepped forward, reading from his notes, "Evidence of tampered medication, your fingerprints on the bottle, payment records to the supposed caregiver, and the suspect we apprehended matches the man who fled this property. We're detaining you for investigation into intentional elder neglect and attempted asset fraud." Mason turned to me then, panic cracking through his voice. "Please, don't let them do this. You know me." I held his gaze, feeling no softness left to give. "You did this to your own father. I don't know who you are anymore." As the handcuffs clicked into place, the broker muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "Carpenter isn't going to like this." The room went still. A deputy asked who Carpenter was, but I answered first. The man behind the land deal, and likely the one pushing Mason toward something far worse than a sale. Rachel closed her briefcase and touched my arm gently. "We'll see this through, not just for the property, but because Thomas deserved better." In that moment, I understood. Justice wasn't only arriving with badges and paperwork. It had begun the second I decided to stop being silent. A week later, the hills behind the ranch lay under a fresh blanket of snow. The house was as quiet as the day I arrived, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the hollow stillness of abandonment. It was the calm that settles after a storm finally breaks apart. I stood by the wooden fence overlooking the land Thomas had poured his entire life into. In my hand rested the safe deposit key and the executed will he'd signed months earlier. Proof of what he entrusted to me. Not out of obligation, but out of belief. The cold wind carried across the field, tugging gently at my coat, as though urging me to release the last remnants of a marriage that had died long before Thomas did. I exhaled slowly and let the past scatter into the winter air. I kept circling back to the same thought. If I had come even a day later, Thomas might have slipped away unseen, his truth buried with him. The weight of that possibility stayed with me. I looked toward the barn, the corral, the endless stretch of white where his horses once ran. Everything felt both fragile and full of potential. I was no longer someone hoping for warmth from a husband who had long ago turned cold. I was the person Thomas had chosen to carry forward what mattered most to him. Protect the land, honor his name, keep it out of hands that would strip it bare. The idea of turning the ranch into a sanctuary for neglected horses, something he once scribbled in an old note, rose in me like a quiet promise. For the first time since returning, a genuine smile found its way onto my face. Blood doesn't decide family. Loyalty does, presence does, and love, the steady kind, not the conditional kind Mason offered, does too. I would live in a way that honored Thomas's last gift. Then I stepped off the porch and into the crisp, untouched snow, ready to walk toward whatever waited next.